All right, greetings, friends and comrades. Welcome back to Tony of One Dime for a continuation on our first conversation on the unity of liberalism, a look at a lesser known French autodidact socialist philosopher by the name of Jean-Claude Michéa. And Tony generated a bit of healthy controversy and perhaps triggered a few comrades listening. Triggered's kind of a condescending word. I don't mean to say it like that, but I think our conversation opened up some thinking about a left that would be broken from or is separate from liberalism. And like all things, separations are never easy to do. Children of divorce know this better than most. But I want to start by giving you a chance, Tony, to maybe tie up any loose ends or respond to some of the comments from our first conversation.
Yeah. So with the comments section, it was interesting because people in my Discord from my audience were kind of baffled by some of the comments. Um, I'm not, because the nature of algorithms is that they show you to people who largely already bought into a certain politics. Now, the more niche you get in terms of topics, it will attract people like that. So part of it is just like, okay, people are sensitive to a lot of heretical views being fed to them all at once. I also think language is a big part of it. I'm a little less careful than you are. I'm probably more careful than some of my other friends who kind of do what I do. Um, but yeah, no, sometimes I use words like woke, right? That for some leftists is a triggering word itself. I did explain what I meant by that, but I mean, maybe perhaps I probably should have contextualized it more for the people who are brand new to my thinking. Because if one doesn't know at all what I'm saying, it's kind of like, oh, this guy looks kind of sus. This guy's must be a reactionary or something. There's another common critique I saw actually in the comments that is a reasonable critique, but it's based on a misunderstanding. So one was that I am doing what I accuse the left of doing, which is dividing the left, wanting to divide the left. And I think this is important to clarify something what I'm saying. When I say in agreement with you that I think leftists should kind of rethink their uncritical complicity with liberalism, and that includes not just voting for the Democrats or economic liberalism, because leftists will think they're not liberals, but it's a lot of that internalized social ideology that they think is leftist ideology. And maybe it is if we were to accept the idea that the left is something else today than the historical definition of the left as a revolutionary force of equality. Today, it's largely, in some sense, the kind of trailblazer and superstructure of capitalism, of progressive capitalism. I would say of the gig economy specifically, and of globalism. When I say the left should distance itself, I am not under any illusion that I can convince all leftists to just stop thinking in this liberal way and adopt my small c moderate conservatism, or as Zizek calls it, moderately conservative communism, right? Or whatever.
That's a pretty good Zizek there. Not bad.
Yeah, not the best, but yeah, I'm not under no illusion that you can just convince everyone. And part of that is because my whole critique of the left is its politics is kind of under this illusion of convincing people. It's under this idea of like, if we can just bend everyone to the leftist worldview. Whereas my approach is to actually build a politics that's based on common interests, because that's based in a reality. I think it's a far more difficult and also not necessarily desirable, probably undesirable at this stage, task to go for the cultural revolution and the economic revolution at once. A lot of leftists have internalized this view that it's necessary to like make the common people relearn everything in order to overcome capitalism. It's a very, I would say, academic PMC top down in social engineering mentality, and it's very much what Michéa is critical of. I
Yeah.
don't think so. I don't think leftists can just unlearn this social pathology of liberalism, because Studebaker goes to great lengths, Benjamin Studebaker, to emphasize this in his book, The Chronic Crisis of Democracy. A lot of the divisions we see within the left are structural and based in a material reality itself. In that, you have this education divide. You have people in a professional managerial class and people aspiring to be part of that class, who often, as a result of what is called sometimes elite overproduction, where people go to school expecting to not be workers, basically, to be better than other people. That's why people go to school a lot of the time, to get a degree, and don't get that. They still have a mentality where they kind of want to prove their education, and also their education makes them sociologically very different from a person without a college degree. It's why degrees, education predicts voting patterns way more than actual like income seems to. Income's important, but really we see now education is the central contradiction. And in that itself, I view that as a microcosm of class itself. In that
You're really talking about the cultural capital that degrees and entry into PMC gives to people. Yeah.
exactly, social
That's what you mean by
mobility.
sociological, right?
Yeah. And
Mhm.
so like because of this, it's very deeply internalized. So as we saw with, I think a good example maybe in practical terms for people to get, a lot of leftists say, will pretend, okay, talk of Bernie Sanders. Oh, Bernie, I'm way more radical than that. Bernie sucks. Okay, a lot of you guys were radicalized by Bernie Sanders, admit it. Huge amount. Okay. And whether it's 2016 for me, just 2016, some were 2020, but it's 2020, I think, was a straw for a lot of people. And a lot of people were surprised that Bernie was winning so much, and that when all those candidates like Warren, Buttigieg, I forget the others. There are a few others that are like progressive lightweights. They teamed up basically to drop out of the race, and they ended up, a lot of these people, voting for Biden over Bernie, and that surprised people, especially with Elizabeth Warren voters,
Right.
because it's like, oh, I thought we were similar on policy.
Mhm.
What people didn't anticipate was the degree to which a lot of people who are progressives, leftists, have a very different project than the kind of project Bernie was going for, which was, I would say, much more working class. Like Bernie in his heart, I'll say this, all social democrats in a really genuine sense, like Bernie Sanders, were once kind of communists or communist sympathizers. In that if you ever had a real class politics, affection for class politics, and that's your goal, you at once had communist sympathies, and that really, it comes through in the way they talk. Anyway, people who couldn't tell that from the way his voter base and his tactics weren't understanding what was going on. Now, the fact that so many people did nonetheless choose these other candidates shows that there was a big divide between what progressives actually want, and that is, a lot of people genuinely care more about the social issues than they do the, economic radicalism of, even not just democratic socialism, if we want to just not give it that term, radical social democracy. That's not even the priority for a lot of people who consider themselves leftists.
Yeah.
And this is, you can't just you can't just ignore this contradiction by saying, oh, those are liberals, not leftists. It's leftists who've internalized liberalism, and that's why there's such a close knit. I don't think, though, this is where I really want to clarify, you can really just undo this contradiction. So I'm not suggesting let's just convert all those people to my point of view, or let's oppose all those people necessarily. It's rather that I think we should allow for coalitions of socialists. For example, I believe we should have a conservative coalition of socialists, a liberal coalition of socialists. I don't think it's practically possible
Mhm.
to just defeat all the progressives, the liberals. It's also just like people in New York are progressive because they've accustomed to that kind of life. Like Zoran Mamdani is able to win in New York because anyone who's been to New York versus New Jersey, right around, nearby, you'll see the huge difference in the culture. Zoran Mamdani could not win in New Jersey, but in New York he does very well. He probably will win by the time this is out, I would predict. So like I would say those people are going to exist, and you can't just like defeat them or just convert them. It's like we should just have a coalition where it's like you allow conservative or moderate, more moderate, like moderate socially, socialists, social democrats in a different coalition that can agree with this side, maybe
Yeah.
on economics, but maybe not on other social policy. The right has coalitions.
Right.
For example, the right has Christian nationalists, it has libertarians, it has white
Sure.
nationalists, it has all kind of coalitions. For us, left is for some reason it's like you are immediately considered post-left, right wing, closeted reactionary, or
Mm-hmm.
whatever if you are slightly harbor any kind of right-coded belief.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas for the right, they have no problem having like Rand Paul and a kind of economic populist like Bannon, who has like left wing ish economics for the right standards anyway, and under the same banner. Whereas for us, it's like if you have anyone who's like slightly remotely conservative, out.
Well, I
And
wouldn't.
I
Yeah.
just think we should open
Yeah.
ourselves to coalitions. I'm not saying, oh, we should, we should just like go fight the
Right.
liberal left. Do you know what I'm saying? That's not what I'm
Well, yeah. I think that's a very good point. Fighting the liberal left within the context of a coalition managed by a bourgeois institution like the Democratic Party will, I think that particular alliance will give an edge uh, to the liberal left ideologically, and their ideology will determine the day. In other words, the socialist within that coalition will always be playing a subordinate role. And for that reason, I would insist that socialists could only create effective coalitions that are um, capable of achieving what you're talking about by working outside of the Democratic Party. Now, part of the reason this is the case is because socialism has to, and this goes back to the wider philosophical point we're trying to derive here, which introduces the question that has been a major object of study for socialists, by the way, of what's called the Republican tradition. This was initiated by Marx's Inferno by William Clare Roberts, Bruno Leopold's Citizen Marx, um, are two exemplary examples of this, but we also see a interest in the neo-Kautskyist turn with Cosmonaut magazine and the Marxist Unity Group and others for something like a socialist republicanism. One of the things that interests me about socialist republicanism, and we can define, and I want your take on the Republican tradition itself, stretching back to major thinkers like Hobbes and Machiavelli and even, across the whole, even Locke and Rousseau and of course Marx, all have to weigh in on the Republican tradition, which predates liberalism. Importantly, one of the things that interests me is that if the Republican orientation to coalition building, to civic virtue, which is a big focus of republicanism, the cultivation of civic virtue, which would initially seem to satisfy Michéa's point that and Orwell's point that socialism has to ground itself in common decency, and the way to do that is to forge a socialism that is what Michéa calls separatist. And that is how he reads the origin of the socialist movement in the 1820s, 1830s, with Saint-Simon up to the Chartist movement. Because keep in mind, Marx and Engels come at the tail end of that, right? And by the time you get to the Communist Manifesto of 1848, you already have a saturated field of various socialist movements. All of them are critiqued in the Communist Manifesto. But Michéa is asking what was so singular about socialism in its entirety that Marx and Engels, actually, he says Engels got this right, but Marx got this wrong, was the insistence on separatism from hegemonic bourgeois liberalism. And he actually critiques Marx as being too teleological and almost too close to a Republican tradition in orientation that cannot see that its form of it results in an acquiescence to liberalism. And this introduces a very interesting thing for him. Eventually, this evolves to an adoption of what's called socialist syndicalism and a kind of quasi-anarchist position, right? Which I don't support. But what I do support is this basic idea that socialism needs to be separatist from the hegemony of bourgeois institutions. And I want your view on that. I'm kind of trying to give an overview of Michéa's point, but also introduce this theme of republicanism. And there's a lot of debates that we can kind of unearth here, right? So I'm bringing us back to the sort of political philosophy of the conversation, because I do think you're wise to raise the example of the Bernie Sanders campaign. And it's very interesting because during that campaign, the Warren-Sanders rift really did seem to make things quite clear in terms of the ideological antagonisms. And for that reason, it was almost refreshing to see it, where like the obvious alignment of Warren supporters fell into like a meritocratic, upper middle class, pro PMC orientation, which was for the preservation of the status quo. But in classic left liberal ideology, they had to disavow that. Whereas the Sanders campaign was much more rough and much more. You said that they're all former communists. I think to some extent that
I
may
think
be
he was
true.
rougher, and I think he was much rougher in 2016, and because he lost California to Hillary Clinton, despite winning a lot of swing states, actually
Mm-hmm.
doing unprecedentedly well in southern states for a Democratic nominee. Uh, he got it in his head. His advisors got in his head that like to win California next time, you have to like do this kind of id poll, appeal to minorities,
Yeah, totally.
adopt, not challenge the kind of liberal stuff too much. And I think that's like so he won California the next time, but then what did he lost like all the other moderate states to Biden,
Yeah, that's a good summary. So, anyways,
which
but I think
included a lot of black voters, by the way. I think that was one of the biggest disconnects is the woke people try to act like he lost to black voters because Bernie didn't just say the word black people enough, like didn't talk about black issues like
mhm,
reparations. And I think what they miss is that black people are predominantly working class, and Bernie losing the black vote is just symptomatic of him just not winning enough working class people against Biden. Because like
mhm.
most people, period, black or white, don't have this like super internalized like, you know, hyper progressive language that people in the universities have,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we're seeing this right now with Mamdani versus Cuomo, and the single biggest determination of support for Cuomo in areas that are kind of outliers of the main city of Manhattan and Brooklyn seems to fall along the lines of education. So Cuomo is technically polling better. We'll see how it plays out with less educated voters. And in a way, that's not surprising. And I feel as if there's a certain way in which the paternalism of the Democratic Party has created a weird. I want to actually get your take on that, but let's shift first back to perhaps this philosophical question about republicanism. Can you articulate for our listeners what is socialist republicanism? Why are you drawn to it? I know you're an advocate of it. And what do you think it allows us to achieve when we embrace it? And then we can get to like the critiques of it and stuff like that.
Yeah, so just to keep in mind, the two things you mentioned there are earlier about republicanism are quite different points that are worth talking about separately because I think they're very different. Like Michéa's critique of Marx's republicanism and your kind of subtle critique that you're alluding to of leftists who embrace republicanism yet nonetheless still internalize a kind of liberal sort of worldview. We can get to both of that. I think those are very different points.
They are very different.
Yeah. But what is socialist republicanism, I guess, for the audience? So, republicanism, as opposed to liberalism, you could look at republicanism is what encompasses a lot of the things we associate with liberalism before liberalism. Republicanism predates it. I mean, it technically goes back to Rome, but as a tradition, it really gets synthesized in the Renaissance by thinkers like Guicciardini, and actually taken in a more radical form by Machiavelli. Machiavelli is often put under the Republican camp, although some have argued he's actually more radical than much of the Republicans at his time when it comes to the democracy question. Famously in England, a lot of these ideas, in Shakespearean England, got started to spread. Like James Harrington wrote Oceana. It's a very classic Republican text. In that you can find a bunch of ideas that would seem very radical for its time and also a product of its time. Like, for example, he believed in restrictions on inheritance of property, and having relatively more egalitarian distribution of property as a whole. Yet he also believed in property qualifications, right? To some extent. So both views will seem, if you take it in its time, it's very radical nonetheless. These ideas spread to the founding fathers of America, and of revolutionary France is probably most famous, But republicanism is a big part of the American founding tradition. It's based on the idea of a republic, obviously, as opposed to a monarchy. A part of the principles of republicanism, what it shares in similarity with liberalism, is a lot of the things we associate at the level of government, such as constitutional rights, checks on power. That's a big thing. Checks on concentrated power, separation of powers, a somewhat distribution of power, as well as representative government, which itself, as I mentioned in the last podcast, is not something inherent to liberalism. It's actually not inherent to republicanism. Representation existed in a form in the Catholic Church. It existed in the medieval age. Actually, part of how the French Revolution, sort of the pretext to it, is them not having a legitimacy crisis and deciding to bring out the ancient parlement. The word parlement, it's because of it literally just means people come together and speak about stuff. It's a way of settling conflicts peacefully. The Republicans, how republicanism differs from liberalism, which emerges explicitly in terms of a doctrine, really not until the mid 1800s, when it comes to basically the social question. Liberals believe in a sort of reformist approach to dealing with the big inequalities of the Industrial Revolution that hits Europe before America. America still, there's not really a proletarianized working class in that same sense. You can still be a small property owner. And there's still slavery, though. But you have, slavery is a good segue to republicanism. Behind the abolition of slavery, a lot of that has to do with republicanism. When it comes to the difference between liberalism and republicanism, liberal ideas, they have despite not being synthesized until like the mid 1800s, they have their origin in what is called social contract theory, like Locke, Hobbes technically, and Rousseau, but really it's John Locke is the guy. You could look at economic liberalism being part and parcel of this with Adam Smith. Basically, when Marx talks about bourgeois ideology, he's talking about ideology that came out of the bourgeois revolutions, and that's what he's talking about. So there's a economic component to this, which is like freedom from state interference in the context of absolute monarchies and big bureaucracies, mercantilism, corruption. This was an appealing doctrine because it checked the state power and delivered ultimately what was very emancipatory for its time, which is the idea that you should just let people own property and do commerce and not just have the elites regulate who can be an elite or just who can get wealth and independence. The crucial difference, though, is unlike republicanism versus liberalism, is that liberalism is very focused on freedom from interference. So liberalism is all about what you can do without the state preventing you from doing it. So it's like, I can do what I want, basically. At the government level, at a social level, social liberalism, manifests in expressing alternative lifestyles, or, if you were to take it to a very more radical conclusion, is where you get libertarianism, both on the right and left. libertarianism in some ways is uber liberalism, in that it's like, if you ask libertarians, they usually will, some of them will not believe even in any restrictions on drugs at all, like decriminalization across the board. Some will say not even driver's license. Economically, this is usually was convenient for a growing property class that became the dominant class after the decline of aristocracy, where attempts to regulate the distribute property of ruling class started to be defended against through liberal doctrine by saying, oh, we don't want the government. It's we have the freedom from state tyranny. The government can't regulate our property. It actually got adopted by slaveholders too, as Lizardo, points out. He's not the first to point that out. But the American South, for example, is a good example, actually. South and North is the division between liberalism and republicanism. The American South championed liberalism without the republicanism, because they embraced this freedom doctrine, because they would say states' rights, it's the freedom of the individual to own property. Slaves were considered property. It's like, how can we have a tyrannical government determine our forms of life? Republicanism is different in that its freedom is based on freedom as non-domination. So that's just not freedom to do what you want. It's freedom not to be dominated. So essentially not to be subject to the will of a master. This was applied most strongly in terms of, being against serfdom, servitude, and most famously slavery. Jefferson, who's a complex figure, was the founder of the Democratic Republican Party. And he was a big proponent of republicanism. He actually believed that you should have a kind of, as C.B. McPherson, a really good political theorist to learn from, calls it a one-class society, which is that Jefferson's sort of petty bourgeois utopia was everyone kind of owning a bit of property. And what he feared would be kind of what Marx writes about as capitalism emerges in the Industrial Revolution, which is a class of propertyless people. Over time, the U.S. gets a lot more oligarchic. Slavery does not get abolished. It actually expands as demand for it expands, as the cotton trade and all of that, and countries are buying from the South. And slavery actually this is the opposite of what Jefferson and the founders expected it to. It expands. It doesn't wither away. The founders thought the slavery would happen to what Marxists thought would happen to the state. They were wrong. So you get the Republican Party emerge in the 1800s, and it comes out of a coalition of radical left parties that come out of what was called the Free Soil Party, radicals in the Whig Party, and then you got Republicans. They form the Republican Party. It's a coalition of people who are, you could say, people who believe in the ideals of bourgeois society, who are opposed to slavery, who want the dominance of free labor, and some people who are utopian socialists. In fact, actually, Marx wrote for a magazine that was, like basically the Free Soil Party's magazine. And this was a big part of the Republican Party in the U.S.'s founding. The Republican Party in the U.S. is a coalition of people, some more moderate than others. Lincoln was actually the very moderate in his party, one of the moderate leaders in his party. And the fact that he had to say stuff like labor is above capital, it's prior to and above capital, it's more important, though, and that ultimately, that's the interest that should be prioritized. He spoke that kind of language because that was what was pervasive in the party and who the party was appealing to. They were for abolition of slavery, because how do you justify being against slavery? It's easy to look at it as wrong today, but it's historically one of the oldest things ever, right? So how do you argue against slavery? I mean, there's the Christian doctrine that Christianity is against slavery, yet Christians still enslave people. The South enslaved people on the basis using liberalism, saying, "Oh, well, it's our right to." Republicans said, "No, freedom is non-domination," and you can't justify that conception of freedom with slavery. After the abolition of slavery, during Reconstruction, when you start to have Thaddeus Stevens be in charge of the greatest wealth distribution in modern history of property from the South to small property owners, and including to slaves, making a lot of slaves into small property owners. Of course, Reconstruction gets very botched. And this is, it was very much an unfulfilled project in the longer term, especially after Lincoln died, and you get all that series of presidential power struggles after that. Nonetheless, what happens, though, is a lot of Republicans actually turn their struggle to labor. So after you get slavery abolition, you get labor republicanism. So labor republicanism, I mean, if you listen to like a lot of people like Richard Wolff, for example, who are Marxists or people who get into it, he often invokes Republican arguments without using the word Republican, which is, think about at the workplace and you're free under capitalism politically, but not economically. Under a workplace, the boss is essentially a kind of mini dictator. The CEOs are, unaccountable to nobody but the shareholders. So what democracy exists in the economy? If you apply those principles in the economy, you get a kind of socialism, but not really a statist socialism. You get a socialism that's supposed to be empowering the people who do the work.
Yeah.
And I do land in that direction. I'm critical of syndicalism for a different reason. We can get into that later, and anarcho-syndicalism. But I do actually take that conception of socialism because I actually think my critique of both Marxism, Leninism, and social democracy, for that matter, is that it's too paternalistic, and that it often ends up being the state kind of containing class struggle by just pacifying people through improving their lives. I mean, these are great things. I'm not against like the New Deal and stuff, or even the Scandinavian social democratic systems. There's a lot of great things about that. But, it's ultimately not the project of like a real socialist Republican project would be for the distribution of property, as opposed to, merely just taxing the rich or redistributing some of the crumbs. And it would also be different, I would say, the perversion in which Marx's idea of the abolition of private property got used by actually existing socialism, which was just not allowing people to own everything and making everyone public property, basically, and having the government own everything. The Republicans would see that as just another form of tyranny, except tyranny from the state.
Yeah. Well,
So yeah.
Yeah.
I hope that encompassed enough.
No, bravo. Great summary. Great context. So let's hit on some points of tension and challenge here. One would be there is in the Republican privileging of freedom from non-domination, and this almost like it almost implies a kind of skepticism, which is, of course, I think a very healthy skepticism of centralized power. There is also a huge emphasis on liberty over freedom and as a priority. And that falls into the question of individualism. It also falls into the question of class and inequality.
That's another distinction I forgot to leave. The individualism, collectivism thing is a big difference between republicanism and liberalism.
Yeah. So there's this individualism question, and there's a question of like the question to me is like sort of what are the blind spots intrinsic to Republican orientations to solving social inequities and to building the just society. And one of them is the problem of property itself and the way that property cannot be like what are the Hobbesian guarantees or mechanisms that would ensure egalitarianism? Could this decentralized form of republicanism adequately produce a sort of society in which each worker can actually engage in a type of Jeffersonian orientation? I think many critics on the left would argue that this is like a fool's errand, or that this is like this misconstrues. So in other words, a lot of contemporary thinkers would argue that you need a bit of Hobbes in order to have collectivist guarantees established for citizen agency, that Republican traditions doesn't adequately think. Say, for example,
Interesting.
say for
I disagree. Republicanism doesn't think that. I actually think
okay,
I would say republicanism is more statist in some ways than liberalism.
oh, that's fascinating. I want to hear your argument there, but like one of the
It's
ways
not in
that
terms of who wields the state. That's the big difference. Republicans are not about opposing centralized power itself. It's the concentration of power. It's whose
yeah.
hands. So it's
Well,
like
that's the
you
question,
can't
right?
have
Which
one
is
party. You can't have just a few hands concentrate the power. But in fact, the state under republicanism for Republicans can and should be able to intervene into social life if it needs to protect the common good. Whereas liberals would be against that. They would say, you can't violate individual rights even if it's for the common good.
yeah, so that's the question, right? Which is how does liberalism or republicanism halt the tyranny of the market as itself a kind of autonomous force in social life that that liberalism, I think, primarily uh, must almost like structurally or necessarily rely upon. And then, of course, the effects of that reliance are the production of an ideal subject that is centered on a kind of conception of bourgeois individualism that itself is like not fully realizable or fully replicable on a mass scale. In other words, it creates like the class problem, and class tyranny creates class society in which only a few can aspire to this version of individualism. So it creates what we call atomization, and it also creates egoism. And one of the things that Michéa, I think, nicely points out is that socialism, before Marx and Engels, emerged to combat liberal egoism, and that in fact, what early socialists told to both liberals and Republicans is the fact that liberty can only be achieved through the solidarity of the working class. And I think that's a very nice point, which is something that he gets from the early socialists, many of whom Marx and Engels were critical of, which is that actually the liberty that you are sort of prizing and privileging, uh, at least for the emancipation of the working class, can only come through our separation from hegemonic forms of power, hegemonic forms of government, including liberalism, and I think even republicanism. So that's a very interesting point. But I think the other point is that I would want to make is that you have to ask, is there a sort of level of a kind of like, especially once we get to like what Lenin called monopoly capitalism, right? How I think a lot of Marxists and socialists have raised the question, is not the celebration of republicanism somehow intrinsically limited for or sort of only capable of fully having success for the petty bourgeoisie, or it sort of like becomes something which the system of corporatism, the system of welfare state capitalism, the system of monopoly capitalism would have to be so thoroughly deconstructed, right? Because those are systems that are reliant on huge bureaucratic mechanisms that ensure for collectivist agency to some extent. And moreover, entrepreneurial orientations to labor and kind of individual freedom in the field of labor becomes very difficult to think when we have the rise of mass welfare state capitalism, right? Especially really starting at the early dawn of the 20th century, and then of course um, fully concretizing and realizing itself after the Second World War.
Well, and then after that, it's gone, more or less, been cut to
Well, it
shreds,
is
especially
it
in Europe.
is gone, yeah. Oh, you mean with the rise of neoliberalism?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. But I think still
Which
none. Go ahead.
Republican rhetoric gets kind of perverted in some ways to justify that, right?
I totally agree. I
Yeah.
totally agree. But still, do you see my point, which is there seems to be sort of a question, which is, all right, once we have the construction of mass bureaucratic capitalist social life, and I would argue that actually we still have in the neoliberal period the same type of Hobbesian bureaucratic state control, although I don't think that it's as like I think the conservatives hype make a hyperbole of that, they exaggerate that, but it's still there. And it has to be there because I do think that there has to be some kind of modicum of a insured collectivist vision. So my question to you is how can we think Republican forms of governance that also is collectivist?
Collectivist. Okay, so there's a lot of things you said there that are worth getting at. I mean,
Please.
first off, to build on my explanation of republicanism before, republicanism differs from liberalism precisely in being more collectivist. Uh, republicanism believes that, first of all, when we talk about republicanism, it's like talking about socialism. It's like talking about communism, liberalism. There are a lot of different directions people run with that. But in terms of republicanism, liberalism, it's really ultimately a governance philosophy. When people synthesize it into an economics, to apply it to economics, it's just applying the political principles to the economy. But not everyone does, right? And that's why you have tensions between socialists and Republicans. Many in France, notoriously, didn't quite apply the principles of republicanism that well to the economy. And sometimes they did in opposite ways you would think they would, like in very non-socialist ways, right? To justify actually cutting the welfare state because, less dependence. We don't want dependence on the welfare state. Thing is, we have to recognize there's a rational kernel of truth to that, even if there might not be good intentions in that. Marx himself was not a welfarist guy at all. I mean, he thought LaSalle, who would be considered radical communist for today's standards, was way too statist and way too moderate. So like, we just to get an idea, like Marx is very critical of statists. Back to this question of collectivism, though. So you often hear this word civic republicanism when talking about republicanism, and part of what that means is that with Republican ideology, there's an emphasis on civic virtues. There's a belief that democracy, insofar as it is to mean anything, has to involve the active participation of people, not just people passively giving consent, right? Like just saying, oh, I vote in an election, I go back to sleep and do whatever I want. For Republicans, there's an ideal of a citizen that is very much involved and actually educated. So like a lot of, the early American Republic, if you read Gordon Wood, I mean, was one of the most pro-education societies in modern history.
That's what we get the Republic of Letters concept, which is a quite beautiful concept of the egalitarian intellectual public sphere, right?
Mhm.
And I'm very drawn to that. Although liberalism has its own version of that, but it bottoms out oftentimes, not always, but often into an anti-intellectualism
Because of
where
relativism.
because of relativism,
So
it's yeah, but also because I think a lot of liberals don't have that same conception of individualism. So there's like something very profound in how the Republican conception of the individual citizen is thought versus the liberal conception of that. And
yes,
I would claim that the liberal conception of individualism, in essence, is like a tacit alliance of the individual to market tyranny. And therefore, it always bottoms out into a type of atomized individualism.
yes.
Whereas the Republican conception of the citizen individual, can you say more about that? Like, how might it differ?
The
Because this goes to
perfect
the collectivist point.
the perfect difference, way to, I would say, explain the difference is liberals believe in expanded citizenship, but less meaning and power to what that citizenship actually entails. Republicans are more restrictive of citizenship, but believe in more active engagement. So early Republicans, back when there wasn't mass education and all of that, and very different systems, they believed in a certain baseline property qualification, but that the people involved are very active in participating, as opposed to like a narrow aristocracy, or what England had, which was kind of like very restricted, very restrictive property qualifications, and people voting in elections, but voting for the representative who would vote for the election, this very indirect form of consent. And this is kind of what is in colonial America, and part of why the founders are able to like build in that ideology is in large part response to the kind of limits of British representation. You know, the fact that the British representation, it's not very democratic at all, you know? And America, you know, people can own property more. There's not property qualifications in early America don't mean the same thing, because like a person who just happened to be like, you know, a settler who leaves Britain, who is actually kind of like a persecuted Quaker, for example, can own property and vote. They couldn't do that in England, right? With citizenship, you'll see Republicans, people embrace that ideology, will actually be very critical of like immigration, for example, not on some kind of necessarily racialist grounds, although it could be, you know, really anybody could have racialist grounds for something. But it's that citizenship means something. You can't just hand it out like candy. You have to you have to participate in your society. You have to become part of the community. There's a real collectivist component, not just this idea of we want citizens as economic numbers. And liberalism is more compatible with capitalism. And part of why republicanism falls out of relevance in large part is precisely because the ideology that's far more suited to the dominant capitalist mode of production, especially as you get globalization, is liberalism. I mean, liberalism is a perfect way to justify okay, how do you have cheaper labor? Well, okay, let's open up our markets, get rid of all tariffs. Let's import a lot of immigrants to do work for cheap, and also have huge reserve army of labor, Marxism economics, which lowers the power of workers, right? But this is justifiable under liberalism. And you can also say, oh, well, all people of all kind of different cultures, they can go practice their own thing. It's whatever. Republicans would more be like, well, we can have immigrants, but they want to be, they should be immersed into the culture. You know, they should be immersed into the political civic culture. It's why America, I think, was particularly very good at integrating immigrants for a certain period. You could say less so after, and is because ultimately, like, there's this melting pot sort of ideology, right? America is an idea, right? You know, you as long as you believe in the ideas, you can become American, and you know, many people do of all kind of stripes. With a big, so like something, there's a couple of things you said earlier that they're important to address about the limits of republicanism. I want to get to. I don't know if you have something to say before that, because I have a kind of retort to the subtle like thing you said about, okay, if Republican is like, how come how come that hasn't happened, or is this feasible? Is that like,
Right.
I have a retort to that.
Are you referring to my claim about I have like an argument that I haven't like written about, but it's like a premonition that I want to write about. It's kind of like I call bluff on contemporary socialist Republicans, quote unquote.
Oh, that's a separate critique
That's a separate point.
about
That
them being actually just liberals.
Well, not them being liberals. I don't think that they are liberals. They don't want to be liberals, but they are like like as we open the comment section, there's a kind of
Mhm.
there's an ideological tyranny of liberalism that
Oh yeah.
has um yeah, kind of kneecapped us in a certain way kneecapped our imagination, our possibility of breaking from its hold. So there's that question. But then there's another question which I raised, I think having to do with um changes to the capitalist system at a mass scale that require mass bureaucratic forms to ensure collective agency is lifted, in which the old ideals of republicanism and its liberty and so on feel uh, as if there has to be like it's sort of not hollow ideals, it's not reducible, but like it's almost constrained by the systemic weight of the system. And I know that we're in a kind of post-welfare system. That's true. That's definitely true. But at the same time, like markets and their globalized status are offer such little capacity for people to engage in this relationship to labor and freedom. So it becomes very difficult to think. Like, in other words, it seems to
Capitalist
me
markets or just markets, period?
capitalist markets in particular are
Yeah.
so overwrought by oligopolies and monopolies
Mhm.
and forms of tyrannous control that unless that is broken apart, I often fail to see how Republican ideals can fully permeate into the economic lives of people.
Sure.
So I guess the point you might say, or any advocate of the Republican orientation would say, well, that's why we have to go all the way with it because it's a political reform of these
Mhm.
corporations that could come from that. And that's very possible. I think the Marxist point of view, especially Marxism in the 20th century, why did Lenin call imperialism the antechamber? Why did he call monopoly capitalism the antechamber of socialism? Right? Why
I mean, the
was
precursor of socialism, just to clarify for the audience. Like, you thought monopoly capitalism was gonna help build capitalism, build socialism.
exactly, which is why there's a
I have a
sort of
I have a kind of critique of this. I used to believe that. I have a video where I verbatim quote that line, actually. Planet of the
right.
Robots back in the day.
Yeah, so that this is kind of the question, right? And I think this is why the Orwell question about common decency and liberty and socialism becomes interesting because clearly there was this large scale collectivist problem, which, and we see it today in China and all of that,
Mhm.
whereby we haven't thought about the regeneration of socialism in ways that differ. We often don't think of it in ways that differ from that. And I think that the neoliberal period, because it has been so destructive to these large scale welfare bureaucracies, and because they're in a certain liminal crisis, it seems to me like perhaps maybe now we can rethink that, if that makes sense. And that's kind of where this conversation is sort of headed. But
Mhm.
pull out if you would first before we go to the other point. What was your response to was it on the welfare point or was there something else?
On a lot of that. Yeah, we'll bookmark the thing you said about calling the bluff on the socialists who embrace republicanism but don't wanna run in the Republican Party, because I agree with that critique.
Well, yeah, that's the point for
I
listeners.
think
So so
that's
so
well,
here
yeah.
we didn't say that straight out. My contention would be that, look, if we truly want to take this argument that Marx, like Michéa makes a point that if you look at the collected works of Marx and Engels and you look at the index across everything they wrote and you look in the index, never did the term left or the left come up for them.
Mhm,
It did not come up for them.
mhm. Only when they're critiquing it. Left and right only comes up in Marx and Engels when they're critiquing largely the British parliamentary parties.
Right. And so, in a way, then why wouldn't contemporary Republican socialists, and I don't mean Republican Party socialists, like as in the Republican Party, I mean socialists that are utilizing the strategic political form of republicanism,
Mhm,
why wouldn't they run candidates in both of the two dominant bourgeois parties? Because that would be
mhm,
the only way in which you could truly, I think, forge the type of independent working class socialism within the electoral arena that would be possible. Because otherwise, you are hamstrung by the Democrats
mhm.
and thereby hamstrung by the hegemony of liberal ideology. And that's where we've been. And I think that there is a sort of fear of doing that. Perhaps you might speculate as to why there is a fear. I have my own assumptions, but maybe I just want to, I'm actually genuinely curious what people think of that. Like, I'm genuinely curious, like, if that
Mhm.
uh, is feasible. I don't know. I know it's not feasible, but
Ah,
why? Maybe we need like a
what's not feasible?
psychoanalysis.
What's not feasible?
I think in the current iteration, the Democrats have terrified the left to such a degree that they have conditioned us to not break from their power, from their
The
hegemony.
left thinks it's not feasible because the left doesn't think it's feasible.
Yeah, because we have been conditioned to be
Mhm.
terrified. To be terrified. It's not just, in other words, it's not just reducible to like Citizens United or
It's
money.
true.
It's not just reducible to that. It's also an
It's why they
ideological problem.
Of course. It's why they never call the Democrats fascist. They call every Republican fascist, regardless if they are.
Yeah, that's why I felt like during Gaza, when Biden was supporting the genocide, people called Biden a fascist, but it was a bit inaccurate because,
I didn't even hear that. I didn't even hear him. They just call him Genocide Joe. I just find it interesting, the selectivity of it. Like
yeah,
it,
exactly.
what
I
it what
think
it just reveals is that how they view both parties as bad, but they still have this like bias that okay, maybe the Democrats will give us some treats. The Republicans never collaborate with them. They also have this idea of Republican voters just like racist, and that the reason why they vote Republican is solely because of material conditions. That's part of it, but they miss out the other component of it. They really think people are stupid. I think they think people are stupid when the leftists talk about why people vote for Trump. They project a huge stupidity on the voters.
which is a stupidity that liberal political philosophers have always maintained. I think actually, if we compare Republicans to liberals in the grand sweep of history, I'm not talking about our contemporary, there seems to be a much less passive aggressive treatment of the category of the masses in the Republican political philosophy than you have with liberalism, which is interesting because that would mean that Republican forms are themselves, if that's true, much more capable of fully overcoming the residues of old feudalist and aristocratic ideologies, which is ultimately what I think is necessary. I would claim, in concert with Losurdo, that liberalism still has that blemish. It still has that hangover of aristocratism.
Well, because it comes out of aristocratic ideology.
Yeah,
Liberalism comes out
yeah,
of that. Republicanism comes more strongly out of the petite bourgeois. We would call petite bourgeois now, but what was this? The bourgeois revolution. The nascent middle sort, as they were called. Whereas liberalism comes both out of that, but also out of aristocracy.
right. So yeah, so where are we at here? So okay,
Let's address the Republican Party thing, and then I'll
please.
get to the monopoly capitalism maybe after. So just because that's going to pull some intrigue, people should read Benjamin Studebaker's book, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy. It talks about this proposal. He floats the idea. I have talked about it with him on various podcasts. People can check out the one called, I think, The False Hope Industry. With this idea of running in the Democrats and Republicans quickly, why? Because the common retort you get with leftists is, well, we shouldn't do either. We should distance ourselves and not go with any bourgeois party. Yeah, okay, you got to consider the context you're in. In some countries, you can start a third party, and it could be revolutionary or reformist, and that's very possible. You could displace it. America is a unique system. It is an exception. People like to say, oh, you treat America as an exception because it is. It's an exception. But what else do you call it? It is an anomaly. It is. The American system is simultaneously one of the most democratic and the least democratic because it has so much flexibility at the level of Congress and at the level of parties in a way that you can run a rogue Democrat, you can, like AOC, you can run a rogue Republican like Marjorie Taylor Greene. In Canada or in England, the whoever runs in the party has to get party approval and has to vote with their party loyalty. The leader of the party can just kick out members of that party in a way that the Democrats and Republicans can't. At the same time, there's a system, and the American system is structured in such a way where literally there is just no possible way at all for a third party to win. You really look at the grand scale of things. This strategy of the third party has been tried so many times. Now I'll just say to leftists, if Teddy Roosevelt, a former US president, one of the most popular presidents in history, couldn't even win as a third party candidate when he ran for his when he started the Bull Moose Party and tried to, because he thought the Republicans were, becoming way too corporatist, started the Bull Moose Party. he couldn't even win. He had the most name recognition of any man in the fucking world at the time, probably.
Right.
Or in America. He couldn't even win. Ross
Or
Perot.
even, well, we should also throw Debs into the mix.
Oh yeah, well, yeah.
Right?
You could
Right?
get like, he scratched like, what was it, like 5% or something? Like,
No, but it's
SP?
a good example of the uniqueness of the American system, because one of the points I want to make, and just hold your thought, is, but it's very much related, is that, the Socialist Party of the USA under Eugene Debs, which really started in 1900 and then ended in World War I, as people know, was an extremely vibrant expression of socialism, probably the most vibrant expression of
Mhm.
socialism in American history by far. Now, one of the strategies that they took was non-cooperation with the strengthening, or they avoided any effort that would strengthen capitalist institutions, including capitalist bureaucracies. Now, back to this point about monopoly capitalism that I mentioned, and its inevitable rise, really concurrent to World War I and then after, that was very much opposed by the Debsian strategy. And that is why
Mhm.
many people later in the New Left period, once welfare state capitalism was at its zenith, at its height, formulated a anti-Debsian position. And this is actually one theory as to where identity politics took over the left, precisely because the New Left insisted upon strengthening capitalist state institutions. But that was never the design of the Debsian approach. It was actually always to have, as Michéa says, the separation, the class independence. Okay. So it's sort of related. And I just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah, well, we can bring it to that with so it's, yeah, I mean, due to the presidential system and the fact that you have to just to get anything even done, let alone win the presidency. There's also the Senate that's separately elected, Congress that's separately elected. Even if you somehow got like a Bernie Sanders through the Democratic Party, which is this is my critique right now of entryism. Entryism has this fantasy of just like winning through the Democrats, and that somehow you'll just like be able to pass Medicare for all. It's like, well, you're not going to be able to do that without the Republicans because of gerrymandering. That's another thing in the American exception. There's gerrymandering, meaning literally the Democrats and Republicans function like a cartel. They carve up districts and they basically can only win in those districts. There are some places where it's literally impossible for a Democrat to win. Some places it's impossible for a Republican to win. And the only way that you can change anything is by getting a kind of different Republican or a different Democrat. So that's the
That's
right there,
why.
the
Have you
justification
ever
for
heard
the
of the
dual
Wyoming
party.
rule? Have you
Hmm?
ever heard of the Wyoming rule as a side point here? It's very much related. This
Yeah,
idea
explain
that,
that.
oh, yeah. So it's this proposal that you can initiate through a majority in Congress a new conception of what qualifies as a district according to the population of
Oh yeah.
Wyoming. And if this was instituted, you would have, how many members of the US House of Representatives are there now? 356? Something
Something
like
like
that.
that.
So if this was instituted, you would have like 1,000. And so you could think about a revitalization of kind of an expansion. And this is very much in line with this Republican idea of citizenship, because it would imply that much more activity would have. So you see, one theory would have it that this would inevitably force the emergence
Hmm.
structurally of a third party, because the Democrats and Republicans couldn't contain
All of those
this.
new districts.
They couldn't manage it the
Yeah.
same way. I kind of like that as a side point. So
I mean, well, I think if that happened, that would be good. However, there's another element about third parties, which is America is incredibly diverse and large. That's another part of its exception. Unlike most countries, there is a thing called game theory, which I very much think has a lot of truth in it, which is about the inherent power dynamics involved in human relations. Have you ever noticed or wondered why socialist parties squabble into a million different parties all the time? Especially the less powerful they get, the more they squabble and split. You know, like Eugene Debs's party was great, but then it split into two parties, and then split into more parties, and split and split. Communist parties just split like crazy. I mean, have you ever thought why that is? It's almost as if like there's a logic to like the less powerful they are, the more they split. And a part of that is because, especially when you have centralized parties, when there's like kind of like hierarchy in it, at some point when people have internalized like, okay, they're not going to win an election, they're not going to really attain any political power, let me just start my cult. That's kind of what it becomes. That's what a lot of parties end up becoming. And you get this situation where you get in a lot of countries, really, you get a lot of mini communist parties everywhere that are just completely ineffective. And what I concern about with third parties is I would be for it, like if it's like under a broader kind of broad big tent org, like the DSA. What I kind of like about the DSA is that it kind of accepts the inevitable diversity of socialism, because America is itself a diverse country. Now, I actually would critique it in that it's not diverse enough, because the DSA, it has all these caucuses. It even has a Marxist-Leninist caucus. It's much more moderate caucus. It has no conservative caucus. So that's what I would critique about the DSA, is it's still very much permeated by liberal ideology. And anyone who wants to say liberals aren't leftists, okay, to the general public, they are. And a perfect example of this might seem pedantic, but you remember that viral moment when it was like the DSA meeting where they couldn't agree over like masking rules and
Right.
which words to use and not to offend people. It was such an embarrassing disaster. And it's like, yeah, this kind of ideology is very much on the left. Anyone who denies it is lying to themselves. So there's what I would say is, yeah, you need to kind of work with the diversity of the nation. The nation is just fundamentally diverse. And with other parties, this is
Yeah.
precisely why I don't think there's not going to be a movement. So I don't believe in the idea of the movement, like one homogenous movement.
Hmm.
There could be socialist movements and groups, and I think it's good to promote most of them,
Yeah.
insofar as they can come to a consensus on stuff that
I
matters.
would.
Because could you imagine the single effect? What if socialists were behind America getting healthcare,
Right.
Medicare for all? That's just a single-handedly massive victory that would raise their credibility
Absolutely.
far more than any ideology. Like actually doing
Right.
something would actually dramatically change their credibility. And that's the unfortunate thing about the American left, is it doesn't quite have that legacy, even that the British left kind of has, or the British
Hmm.
left partially infiltrated the Labour Party. Whereas in America, really, like the New Deal, as good as it was totally top down. There was nothing social democratic about it at all. It was really like a corporatism that wanted to stabilize capitalism.
Yeah, the New Deal came as a favoritism, but it was preceded by decades and decades of socialist struggle that made it possible.
Which is why leftists should still claim it. I do think
They
leftists
should
should
still
still,
claim it. Yeah, they
yeah,
should still
for
claim
sure.
it. And I think that, if you look at that period of 1900 to 1914 in the Debsian period, it offers, I think, the best model for us moving forward of what a viable socialist party could look like. But keep in mind, it also was connected to the international. And I think that is essential, which is something that we lack. So there has to also be an international dimension. And we know that, I think,
Oof.
historically, the Socialist International.
Well, we should remember what happened after to that. That became a
Well,
mouthpiece for a country.
that's true. That's true. However, I think as a unified force for the expansion of socialism, and I mean, in other words, I do think that Marx's later insights into the necessary international dimension
Oh boy, this is
of,
where I'm very critical of Marxism and leftism, actually.
yeah, now here you're going to be like an anti-Stalinist socialism in one country.
Well, yeah, I'm not again. This is the thing about socialism in one country. It's like you don't obviously just want socialism in one country, but internationalism is rubbish in practice. In terms of internationalism as a ideal end goal, that's great. Internationalist politics is fictional. If you believe in, something everywhere, it's going to happen nowhere. That's not how things work. You can only affect people in your area and your people of your same language, of your same culture. The reason why internationalism, what it ended up becoming, was a Soviet expansionism. and everyone knew it. And that's why people who were associated with this, with the international, the Comintern, were super. I mean, I would blame the Comintern partially on the rise of fascism in Italy. Like, a big talking point that was very powerful that the fascists constantly made, and that liberals actually agreed with because it had a lot of truth to it, was that the communists, because there was a communist socialist split after in Italy, were basically just like agents of the Soviet Union, and that Italy was going to fall under the influence of the Soviet Empire. Now, it's easy to say that's as propaganda, but it's true if you look at what happened in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe, sure, the countries had their own systems and autonomy, but it very much was like America's relationship over Latin America, and that they have independence, but whenever they try to go their own way, they do a coup, they send in tanks, they crush protests, do mass repression. It was a kind. I mean, Mao himself called it imperialism, right? I mean, there's a long line of socialist critique of Soviet policy, and I'm partially critical of internationalism as a style of politics because it just becomes often in the same way that like, think about American neoconservative internationalism. What is it really? Global American hegemony, McDonald's everywhere,
Right. Right.
So it's like that's why
I'm not
people are
arguing.
revolting against globalism, and I
I'm
think
I
there's a
Yeah.
bit of like a corporate communist fantasy with some leftists. I'll
Well,
say.
hold on. I mean, I'm
Let me.
not
I got to
advocating.
elaborate on that term though. I can't just throw around Marjorie Taylor Greene terms and not elaborate.
Yeah, you got to be careful. The comment sections are going to go very brutal on you if you do that. But I'm not advocating
Yeah,
for a initial priority, because I think that one could claim that there has to be the construction of the development of what we might call the maturity of the socialist movement, which would have to begin locally, right? Which would have to be separatist, not only culturally, but also politically, as I shared the example of the Debsian example. But inevitably, because capitalism is intrinsically a multinational, international system, the growth and the strength of the socialist movement will itself develop a different orientation to internationalism. It's not to say that we have to, but I do think that there has to be some coordination of socialism as an ideological project internationally,
sure.
globally.
You need a better version of the UN. Like, I can get behind that absolutely.
Right, exactly.
I
Because
don't believe though in the
we're
idea.
not really touching um the function of the non-productive sphere of the state, which is at the is at the center of imperialism. We're not capable of doing that, and then we almost become isolationist. We become quietist on the international scene, which I don't think we should be, because if Michéa's whole vision is kind of correct, and I think that it is, part of the problem of hegemonic liberalism is that its cosmopolitan subject develops a situation in which um, it it has an internationalism based on
Uh-huh.
atomized individualism. What would internationalism not based on atomized individualism look like? That is powerful. That could be potentially quite powerful. You could then respond by saying,
I think
well,
it's impossible. Look, I think if you can't do socialism in your country or even a
I'll give you
local
an
area
example.
first, it's unthinkable. It's
I'll
like
give
you
you an
got to start
example.
at scale first.
I'll give you an example. If you look at the Cold War period, right, the ideals of American religious liberty, for example, were weaponized in what's called the Cultural Cold War across Africa, across Central Asia, for example, like Muslim majority societies in Africa, some Muslim, some Christian, it was mixed. And the mode of American religious freedom was used as a kind of weapon for the expansion of capitalist markets. But also, the ideal of the American entrepreneur, the Horatio Alger myth, that was also put onto these societies. And it was competing against a collectivist Soviet version of the individual, I think it must be said. Now, what I find very interesting about this whole idea we're talking about would be, what does the myth of the individual look like when it is reflective of the common virtues from below? And that could be quite powerful as a myth, because
Mm,
I'm not necessarily opposed to individualism. I'm opposed to bourgeois individualism. I'm opposed to individualism that's subordinated to the tyranny of the market and its instrumentalization, right? And I think we're both on the same page there. So you see my point. There could be something extremely egalitarian, liberatory about the expansion of that. And that's why I don't want to give up on internationalism. I
mm.
don't want to like participate in a blind capitalist internationalism, but I don't want to give up on it entirely.
I will say I'm critical generally of any sort of political project that starts with an idea that we just need to like start an idea from scratch and then somehow promote it and then it'll spread. I think generally all ideas that succeed are just always built on ideas that exist and movements that exist. And that's why like changes to the world are already outgrowths itself of the world spirit. Like that's why for me internationalism is kind of like why have an internationalist based politics? Because if your politics is genuine and genuinely reflective of a zeitgeist, it will become international anyway. Like if you look at the far right, I think this is why it's reaching a point where it's beyond impossible to just deny. The far right is well, insofar as we really depends what we mean how far it really is, but whatever. The far right is the zeitgeist right now, and it's every you look at so many governments across the world are just electing right wing governments. So like so many countries around the world. That's like it looks like an international revolution almost against globalism. Now there was no international that didn't happen because Steve Bannon and JD Vance went and told Europeans that they need to be against globalism. This was like happening by itself
Mhm.
for a while. So I think yeah, from below, I would support internationalism from below. Like, if the left was to have its if we buy this is the thing, I don't really buy into the left right thing so much in that if there was like a working class uprisings across the world, which in some ways I actually viewed part of the right as in some sense an attempt to kind of it's part of that actually. And that like if you look at the voting demographics, the people who
Mhm.
are voting for the right-wing parties, it's predominantly the working people.
Right.
Um, and that's something to square. And a part of that I think is, there isn't simultaneously like a socialist movement that's there that is capable of actually reflecting people. Like they don't feel represented. And if just like so many people across the world are not fucking with leftism, to put it bluntly, you gotta at some point question the leftism. Like, is it just everywhere? Everyone everywhere is brainwashed. Now you just need to fight the right. Oh, I got so many comments like that in the last thing. It's like, oh, we can't give in to the right. We just need to. We can't. We just need to. They just need to
Right.
be try harder. At some point, you just got to look in the mirror. Like, there's this. It's happening everywhere. When you have shifts happen everywhere, it is that means it's like part of a. There's a deep truth to that movement, in the sense that the defeated communism and socialism more broadly dealt with the social question. They would have lost if they didn't give any concessions. They would have lost if they got no concessions. They would have if they thought that this is just an ideological fad concocted by Marx or whatever, that there's no real reason people have to be voting or joining the parties that they do, they would have lost. So they had to adapt to that. Um, so like the politics, you have to adapt to the zeitgeist, but you also have to intervene into it to make a change. So like that's where you have to intervene, and that's something. It's a much harder task. Probably is also contingent to some degree. What I think I'm quite critical of is there's this kind of subtle, I'll call it a corporate communist internationalist fantasy among many leftists. And I've heard some Marxists express it literally. In fact, I used to kind of partially believe it myself. So before I elaborate on what I mean by that corporate communist fantasy, I want to clarify when I say that the rise of the far right globally, internationally, is like in part a working class uprising. I more mean a common people uprising. So that includes petit bourgeois, working class, people who constitute the majority. And if you look at voting patterns based on income and education, that's just undeniable. Now, that doesn't mean, when I say that, I'm under no illusion that the far right is going to deliver emancipation of the common people, of the working class, or to deliver anything like socialism or even social democracy. It might ultimately be a net negative. Who knows? You know, that's why I'm like, that's part of why I'm not part of the far right. I never thought about joining the right, because I see as many contradictions there as I do on the left. In that, you have on the one side a kind of return to traditional Christianity, but also ignoring everything in Christianity about equality and wealth and all of that. So with that, that's important to like look at that as a rejection, because you look at a lot of leftists, they think that they're doing effective propaganda against Trump when they say, oh, you really think this billionaire is going to represent working class interests? And it's like, that's not why I don't think that's why a lot of people vote for Trump, or vote for a lot of right-wing people for that matter. They vote because it's a rejection of globalism. People want to, like, they're sick of the liberal ideology being imposed on them. And also there is a kind of economic and cultural interest when it comes to the immigration question. That's why that's been the issue everywhere for so many people. It's because you think about this idea of like just everywhere, every people across the world just like going everywhere. I mean, it's just very new and unnatural. It's not how societies lived. Like, migration has always happened throughout history, but in small bursts at a time. It's not like just this capitalist immigration, which is treating people like economic units. Now, some leftists will often admit that this is a symptom of capitalism, but they're not taken seriously by people, because what they say is, oh, it's a symptom of capitalism, and therefore we shouldn't do anything about it other than maybe just make everyone citizens and somehow act like that wouldn't cause people to just flood the countries even more, because they also will be ambivalent about borders. They'll say borders are oppressive because they believe in a stateless classist communist society, but apply that logic to now for some reason. It doesn't make a lot of sense when you think about it. The you would They're not taking, like, people don't see them as serious. But a lot of people think like, if you elect a leftist, they're just gonna like, you're just gonna have tons of migrant workers now steal their jobs. And they love to say, oh, the migrants aren't stealing your jobs. Yeah, not your job, not the white collar jobs. AI is stealing your jobs, not immigrants. For people who work in like the fields or who work in construction, all of that, of course, like, this is, have you people read like Marx? This is, the reserve army of labor. It depreciates power. And yeah, of course, all this is symptomatic of capitalism. That's why I'm a socialist, you know? And I think the right's problem is it doesn't focus on capitalism. It just has this very like people versus elites, very vague notion. And that's why it doesn't do anything really to reverse it. If you look at like Maloney's policy in Italy, she's curbed illegal immigration, but she did the foreign work visa thing so that they can like fill the labor shortages, and people are pissed off. And it's like, well, there you go. Capitalism is symptomatic. Is the underlying problem. That said, you can't tell people that you're gonna like not do anything about this issue at all until capitalism's overthrown. How that happens, most socialists couldn't explain it, because socialists can't agree on that. Or what
And
comes
well,
after.
it certainly is not going to happen through uncritical partnership with these big, like pseudo liberal progressive institutions that don't care to address the elephant in the room, but give you window dressing solutions to protection of the vulnerable, of minorities, and so on, which is such a two-faced thing. It's so two-faced that even when you and I criticize it, people will wonder if we harbor some sort of interior secret hatred of
Fascist agenda.
yeah, but this is the damage that has been done, where we're trying to actually think of like a true break from an alternative of that would truly materially address the vulnerable. Of course, like the SNAP benefits are about to be, the food stamps is about to be cut. That's actually 20% of the population of Washington, D.C., including 50,000 children. I care about the vulnerable. Don't get me wrong
Mhm.
ever about that. We're trying to think out of the box in a certain way, and I think
Well,
that
you can't buy into their thing. It's really like they're
yeah, you
hiding
can't.
they hide behind vulnerable, like, human shields, 'cause they're not honest when they say that. Like, if anyone's a socialist, obviously you care about the vulnerable,
Yeah, it's a given.
unless you're a
Totally.
Nazi or something, but, like, like,
Right.
obviously you care about the vulnerable. They just say that because it's their defense mechanism to, like,
Yeah.
you know,
Well, I wanna get back to this kind of
corporate
qu
communism.
yeah, and the kind of quasi Hegelian point of the a sort of world spirit, right? In a
Uh-huh.
certain way, Ernst Bloch, the Marxist
I like
philosopher
him.
that wrote The Principle of Hope, he had this idea that in revolutionary times, you have a kind of not yet what he called the not yet conscious that is imbued within a class. And he called it like a rising class. And so you have, like in the French Revolution, you have elements of the proletariat fusing with the bourgeoisie to actually enact a kind of world spirit, which ultimately kind of uh, solidified in the figure of Napoleon itself, which was a regression actually of the impetus of the Jacobin universalism. And then we know that the whole maturity of the bourgeois project takes off from Napoleon onward. And so one of the things that Bloch says, right, is that in modern kind of post World War II consumer capitalist society, the masses, the general working class, etc., it's not that they're no longer the revolutionary agent, but they no longer have the same touch with the Hegelian world spirit, and they no longer. And so, like in a way, what's interesting though is almost like the dialectic upside down today, where like I think you're right that the proletariat condition expresses itself through these reactionary channels. But we have to actually like deeply analyze what actually that means in the sense that if we conclude or what we conclude from that. If we conclude from that that a kind of brute empiricism that I don't know, nothing can be changed in it or something that there's nothing that it's almost like an inert object. That's kind of what I'm hearing you say. In other words, that like you're skeptical of my proposal of proletarian separatism. A, because you seem to think it privileges culture too much, which I think it privileges both culture and politics, by the way, which I tried to articulate
Well,
through the Debs example. But B, I think
you
that
have to probably we have to probably elaborate on that a bit because, that you're responding to, I think, something one of our voice messages, not something I said in this chat.
okay, well, let's do it. So
We gotta get the
okay,
corporate communism first, though.
okay.
That's very integral to the Zeitgeist thing.
Well, I was a little confused by your claim because on the one hand, you say
I articulate it in the Theory Underground, the newest volume,
what
volume
you
2.
okay, no. What you just argued though at the same time is that right now the masses are leaning to the right,
Mhm.
and that there's not much we can do about that. And then you said, moreover,
Well,
that history sort of
there's something we
function.
can there is something we can do about that, but it's not like we can just make them all left. Because this is the delusion of politics. A lot of people who vote right don't think of themselves as right wingers.
True.
That's the thing. Leftists project their own ideologism
Yeah.
onto like the common people. Most regular people don't think in left and right terms. They don't.
Yeah.
Like a
This
lot
is
of
what.
people, the most common thing in America is like, oh, I like Bernie, I like Trump. That's so common to hear from working class people.
Yeah.
They're like on opposite ends of the spectrum. How could you like both? But like it makes sense if you actually understand why, right?
Yeah. This is what the cybernetic theoretician Gregory Batson calls a double bind, which is like a binary that if one side is affirmed, it must be so. If another side is affirmed, it necessarily excludes. And so the people have this kind of double bind imaginary of right and left. And I totally agree with you. The problem with that, I think, is that it reaffirms a unified bourgeoisie. I feel that left populism at
Oh,
its
I don't believe
best.
that either. I don't believe that either.
No, I actually do think so. I think it is true. I think that
Unified bourgeoisie?
here's what I mean. I think that across the left and the right, as we pop in a popular sense know it, the people often see the unity between the two, and that the revelation of the unity of interest, of material interest across, say, Republicans and Democrats, periodically will make itself known. And thereby the difference between the two is kind of a mirage. And that's kind of the populist realization. The populist realization is that. And that's a healthy realization,
Oh,
right?
yes. Yeah. That makes no, I totally, yeah, of course.
But that's also the Marxist. That's
Yeah.
also the Marxist realization. I think that Marxists, and maybe this dovetails to your point that a lot of communism, in your view, is like too copacetic with large scale collectivist bureaucracy.
Yeah. Okay. This brings right into the corporate communist thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, okay, I see that point. But this idea of the working class and this Hegelian kind of world spirit thing is interesting to me, because I think in a certain way we have almost perhaps a reversal of what the proletariat was from the 19th century today, whereby the
Oof.
proletariat of the 19th century, like Lenin said, every worker will intrinsically have a common sense towards socialism. That's actually something Lenin insisted upon in many of his texts. And today, this is not true.
Well, I don't think that was ever true.
I think actually it was more true then than it is now.
Well,
And that
it's
has to
true in that
do,
it's like it's in their interest to go for socialism. But the thing about socialism as an economic goal, there's so many different socialisms. That's the thing. Depends on what we mean. For internet, people didn't gravitate to a lot of the internationalism. That's why social democracy and fascism were more popular than Bolshevism was. Bolshevism didn't really rise organically in almost anywhere, without exceptional circumstances. Like it
he
really
meant the distinction
because it's
between,
like if you have this thing that says, "Oh, we emerged," this ideology that emerged in Russia. That's for the international. It's just like people are like, okay, what?
no,
This
Lenin
is
didn't mean Bolshevism. He meant
yeah.
socialism, but he meant it like as a category of like socialism versus capitalism in kind of
Sure. Yeah,
abstract
no,
categories.
Well, Lenin's just a Marxist for Russia. That's kind of what I do appreciate about him is he recognized what he's doing as something fundamentally tailored to the context of his time.
Yeah. So, anyways, my point being is that I think you're right that the right, or that the broader proletariat in the world today has generally been seized by the right. What would you say about that historically? Do you think this is like a truism that has sort of always been thus?
No, I don't think the working people always voted right. I mean, there's statistical evidence
Yeah,
about all this. Like Thomas Piketty, I always keep citing this because people should really read it, and it's a quick read. The Brahmin Left versus Merchant
Brahman
Right.
left.
It's called.
Mhm,
It's not titled that though, but that's the conceptual framework. It's
mhm,
called something like Studies in Electoral Democracies or whatever. It's largely by Europe, but the trends he shows is like people actually did used to vote on class
right,
very much, very consistently. In fact, you see a total reversal of that gradually, kind of with the late 60s, but especially like the neoliberal turn. And you get this rise of like, Green Party leftism. You get the rise of like green parties, third
right.
way neoliberal parties, social democracies who want to catch up. So they adopt all this sort of like intersectionality
But
language.
wait a
Like,
second, but isn't Piketty's point that people used to vote according to class interest, but perhaps you could say now people vote according to class, but detethered from collective interest? In other words, voting patterns
I
are
think people
more,
still vote in partially in class interest. Like I said, I think immigration is class interests.
I see what you mean. Well, I guess maybe the point would be in the neoliberal
It's just
period.
part of why it's so strong is because you got culture plus class. That's a powerful combo. I think the right does lag on class because it is on the immigration front. Its rhetoric does lag behind what it actually does in the sense that the right isn't actually all that anti-immigration as it says it is. Like in that, like you see all this conflict with Musk wanting to bring the visas, right? And the MAGA being mad about that, but because it's like, of course, the capitalists want illegal migrant work. This is Trump's hotels were built by Polish illegal migrants, and they don't want to address inequality in any other serious way. So I think the rights project's bound to fail, by the way. But I think unless you have an alternative that works, that's better, that can beat these forces, people will actually go farther right rather than left. And that's what we've seen. People thought that as Trump fails, you're going to see people gravitate to the left. But we look, has that happened?
Well, the liberal parties are not the left. That's the first point. And no, it hasn't. I see your point.
They are seen like the left because look, in France, the liberals and leftists teamed up to defeat what was going to be a guaranteed victory of the French far right, who won the working class vote.
But this sounds more like desperation than interest. I think you're right to say a bit of it's of interest, but there's also this extra element of not revenge, but maybe resentment, which is
culture. But culture is part of interest.
culture,
So when I say
resentment.
interest is not only material. You have an interest in wanting a high trust society. Part of why leftists and liberals don't understand the concept of high trust societies because they're cosmopolitans who are rootless.
Why
They
don't you
live in-
explain that for the listeners?
So the reason why globalist is a slur often used along with leftists is because it's people who are everywhere and belong nowhere.
Right.
And a lot of leftists, in fact, not like all leftists, obviously. This is the thing about the left. This is why I don't believe in the category. It encompasses many people who are authentically just for working class movements or for petit bourgeois, people who are for class politics, and then people who are this rootless cosmopolitan thing. The rootless cosmopolitanism, it's basically like, okay, well, in Europe, it's the most blatant because in Europe, if you have any privilege at all, you can kind of like live across Europe, go to universities across Europe. It's very easy. People who are actually working class don't. So and there's a huge disconnect in Europe. That's, I would say, even more exaggerated than in the US, where you had this in Canada as a problem too. They call it the Laurentian elite. And where like people who basically have this privilege, they develop a sort of like, I don't want to say disloyalty, but like they come to think like, okay, well, nationalism is tribal, ethnicity is all tribal. Aren't we above that? What they don't consider is that even if they're maybe technically right, human nature has been tribal for mostly all of its history. I think that's safe to say. And being a cosmopolitan is a fucking privilege. It is a privilege. It's a privilege to be able to be so open-minded that like every culture, it's, you're so open-minded, people of various places, you've tried all the cuisines. That's a luxury. I understand this because I'm someone who very much embodies who embodies the rootless cosmopolitanism. I just have a kind of like self-awareness of it due to having like
You're a third culture kid.
Yeah, and I'm also mixed race. I kind of
Right.
nationalism never at an ethnic level never appealed to me. Canadian nationalism kind of did, but that's because I view it in a post-racial way. But even then, I'm also American citizen, so it's like dual loyalty, I guess, as they would say. But the point is like there's an out of touchness that happens where people say like, how this is just racism. But a lot of people who've lived with people that they've spoken the same language to, who they understand are familiar to them, it's understandable for them to want to like keep it from changing so fast.
Right.
I mean, like, a good example of this, people complain about tourists. Everyone. Everyone likes to say, oh, I hate this place. It's so touristy. Why do we complain about tourists? Foreign people who are coming who aren't really immersed in the culture.
Yeah.
And that's
Well,
the
that's
thing
the
for
thing.
immigrants to be able to immerse themselves in the culture, they have to come slowly and at less of a gigantic rate. Because, I mean, I understand it. Like, if you're an immigrant and you have a huge community who speaks your language, who's of your culture, I mean, it's easier. It's easier to be welcomed by people you know. It's human nature. I don't blame the immigrants. I never like to preach immigrant hatred. And I think we should talk about this in a
Yeah.
way that's just like objective, not like, because it's like the immigrants are doing what's in their interest too. They're not like doing anything really wrong, but that's the problem is you see a total societal breakdown if you have this continue at the rate it does. And that, like, if you look at this, we can get into the corporate communist fantasy after that. You respond to that
Well,
because it
yeah,
relates.
maybe it's related in the
It
sense
is
that
related.
the corporate communist fantasy, although that's not the best phrase for it, because the problem that I have with that is that it seems to almost like conflate like n- I hate this like Curtis Yarvin idea that neoliberalism pregnant within it is like a communism. I hate it
Well, some
because,
communists say that.
well, I think they're mistaken and this should be contested, right? Because this, first of all, that's a tactic that began, and Lukács has a great essay on this, that began with the Nazi Party in Germany as a propaganda technique.
But
It,
don't
it,
you think it began with Lenin?
no, no, it was, if you think about it,
Corporate monopoly capitalism is a precursor to socialism.
if you have an enemy,
There's, of course, yeah.
one great strategy to kneecap them is to take their rivals
Mhm.
and to conflate you with your rival,
Sure.
right? And that's what the Yarvin
Oh yeah.
slash Nazi, that's what it's intended to do.
I was debating on bringing actually that Judeo-Bolshevik thing because it's related. I was about to
Yeah,
say, why was that so popular and believable as a theory?
it still is. I was
Yeah, but
just
why
watching
is it? That's the thing.
Norman
Whenever
Finkelstein win on Candace Owens, and God bless Norman Finkelstein for all of his work, a former Maoist, did not challenge Candace Owens when she said that we have, Bolshevism within, liberal society today, right? That would have been a great
right.
opportunity for Finkelstein to correct that. But they say it, I think, because liberal ideology requires this hyperbolic enemy on the one hand, but they also say it to conflate liberalism with socialism
We
when,
know why they say it.
yeah, that's why they
But the
say it.
question is, why do people believe it? That
Well,
has
I
the
mean,
kernel of truth.
well,
And
also
that's like,
because,
of course, Bolshevism didn't intend that. But if we look at what communism became,
yeah,
communism as a Kautsky wrote about this as early, is when even before Stalin took power, which is that, in his essay, Why Communism or Socialism, which is at this point, the distinction between communism and socialism is one over method and of state expansion. Like where like communism is the idea of like the government controlling everything essentially, and socialism is the government controlling stuff. But it's what Richard Wolff's parody. Socialism is when the government does stuff, right? And like I mean, in terms of what this like, so this started with war communism, where I'm more lenient to Lenin than like maybe Chomsky or others would be. Is Lenin at least admitted that wasn't socialism? He called it
yeah,
state capitalism.
hmm,
Stalin calls it socialism and says all classes are abolished. When all the enemies to the bureaucracy are liquidated. The Khrushchev, of course, then calls it state of the whole people, yada yada. From there, socialism at this point is basically just bureaucratic control,
hmm,
and socialists across the board kind of like a lot of them accept that, except the people who are the new rise of resurgent Marxist Leninists. Who, what's interesting when you ask Marxist Leninists what communism is, they often kind of reaffirm the bourgeois propaganda, where they will say, like they'll post pictures of China's, industrialization and cool buildings and trains and say, see, communism works. So communism is just when like you have a very powerful government that does like capitalism.
yeah,
So
or they, right. Yeah, I agree with you.
and you
In a
think about what,
way,
so communism basically for the average person,
yeah.
a lot of people just means when they say communism is a slur, it's just
Hmm,
bureaucracy.
hmm,
Bureaucracy. So like when we say corporate communism, it's kind of what David Graeber writes about in a lot of his work, which is that the modern manifestation of capitalism, it's like the worst of both worlds in some ways. It's
yeah.
like hyper corporatist capitalist, but also like super statist and bureaucratized mass surveillance and collusion between the state and corporations. And that's what they mean by corporate communism. You know,
I know, I understand that, yeah, but I think we should do all that we can to sort of disentangle socialism, precisely because when that vision is affirmed, we miss out on this capacity to generate what I'm calling the separatist option. And I do think, actually, I do want to insist on this because I do think that that form of degraded Marxist Leninism, although that's not even fair to call that true Marxist Leninism, in my opinion,
What's
will
true
not
Marxism-Leninism?
adequately, its biggest problem is that it will not adequately address the class. The wider aim of Marxism is the abolition of class society. The affirmation of what you're talking about, corporate communism, will definitely not achieve that. And moreover, it will definitely not
Well, it
think
is abolishing all the other classes except the oligarchs and renters. So that you'll own nothing and be happy. It is abolishing the petite bourgeoisie. It is abolishing social mobility, and the middle class.
right,
So it
but
is
that
abolishing class, but in a way that is making it even like a, techno-feudalism, as Varoufakis would
what
call it.
it's yeah, what it
Capitalism itself is like, well, that's the thing. I don't buy into techno-feudalism as a thesis because I agree with Marx that capitalism itself already was something separate from bourgeois society. And bourgeois society is what a lot of the right-wingers and libertarians think they are talking about when they say free market capitalism. They're talking about bourgeois society, but that's pre-capitalism. Capitalism as a kind of hegemonic system is itself this system of
right,
constant expansion, and that's
right.
why I do agree with, like, that's why I'm influenced by the Marxist critiques. Like,
Yeah.
there's
No,
I
I
think
think
that's integral.
we're in alignment there, in general. But the point I was trying to make was this kind of theme that Michéa, in these 2 episodes we've been trying to bring out, I think helps us think, is the cultivation of what we might call like a new type of independent class politics that is in line with, and here, but then becomes a debate. Like, okay, we have the Republican tradition as a sort of political strategic instrument that socialists can use to further their aims. But we also have this emphasis of socialism in a very dynamic way that would be about creating like an incubatory space for the construction of new virtues, of new political ideals, a republic of letters, a new way of thinking about intellectual life and production, a new way of thinking about politics, a new way of thinking about culture. Like a multiplicity of things can be made possible and then expanded and then scaled out, right? That's quite beautiful in my view. That's quite in line with the kind of socialism that I want to promote, that I want to support, that I want to get behind. And I think we should ask ourselves, what are the impediments to that? And the idea of non-domination is extremely attractive, and it's very much in line with Marx. So I'm in love with the whole Republican socialist thing, not the Republican Party, but this wider vehicle. And I think it should be championed. But as I said, and I want your take on this, do you agree with me that people are still kind of trapped by the liberal hold that
Mhm.
we can't go all the way? And maybe it's the task of the left to sort of remove these taboos that are kind of
Mhm.
barriers to our experimentation, because this is experimentation. It's experimental in a way, because it would be about inventing forms of political coexistence and solidarity that can adequately produce freedom and liberty.
Mhm.
Yeah. So what are our constraints? And maybe it's kind of like these thought taboos that
Mm.
kind of hold us back, right? It's not an easy task what we're trying to propose here, in my view.
No, it's not.
It's a pretty uphill battle, you
Which
know?
is why the task, I think, is every leftist should be, or a person on the left should be criticizing the left from a meaningful way. Part of why I
Yeah,
criticize the left,
yeah.
I don't go on Tucker Carlson and talk about how bad the left is, because why? What would that really do other than just like preach to the choir? Maybe I can throw in some socialist ideas here and there, but like ultimately, if my audience is going to be predominantly people who tend to be left wing adjacent, my job is far better served by critiquing the left. And I always don't understand when I get backlash. You critique the left too much. What about the right? Why would I do that? Most of the people who listen to this show already probably agree with that. Like, what
Mhm.
we just need more affirmation for like why the
Well,
right sucks.
I would
It's
actually say that
like they're not watching my show. Like I'm under no illusion that like normal like most Trump supporters aren't listening to my show. Maybe
right.
they'll watch my main channel videos here and there, if at all. They're not going to be watching my podcast, like because it's just too lefty coded, right?
Mhm.
So for them, even it might be too right coded for some people on the extreme fringes, but I don't think most people are extreme. That's where I'm cynical about the left. I'm not that cynical about the mass because I actually don't think a lot of people are that extreme. A lot of people are not extreme in either direction. I don't think we have to worry about tailing neo-Nazi views because I actually think we're at a very different context in history.
I
Where I
do
think
think that's a very relevant point, which is tailism.
mm,
If if left if
left
socialists
tails the Democrats now.
we do, and that's unfortunate. But if we envision a strategy in which we run candidates in both parties, the question would be on what basis are you generating loyalty and discipline from those candidates? Like, for example, the Mamdani AOC dynamic with the DSA has kind of shown that the DSA is not able to discipline them.
But in
So
what
you're
sense, though? I found the Mamdani.
but
I'm
he
pretty
hasn't done it yet. But we assume that he will betray the principles of the DSA. I think maybe we could say that.
interesting.
I don't want to be negative, but I think
I
it's
just think they
likely.
should focus on just getting more people, honestly, rather than like getting a few people and expecting them to like vote on things principally as if it's going to make a difference because they're like a minority in Congress. Like you just need to get more people before you even have that thought. Like what's the point? Even if AOC was to like be the most principled, it's like 5 people would agree with her maybe, like in Congress. You need to focus on getting more people who you can like I envision like, imagine you had like a Curtis Sliwa type figure who had more socialistic politics. Maybe he wouldn't call it socialism, but he would be like, well, we believe in the common man. We shouldn't, no one should be having 3 properties. That's crazy. You know, like you just had something like that. And like they might not agree on trans rights with the Democrats, but they could agree on Medicare for all, perhaps, or like a, you know, you know, property quota or a, wealth tax even. There's all kind of things you could imagine from there. With what's really important to stress from before about corporate communism, because I brought, we're going to Marjorie Taylor Greene and stuff. So, the big obstacle, right? And part of why I'm attracted to socialist republicanism is because of its non-status element, but at the same
Yeah.
time, it's not like anarchism. Problem I have with anarchism is that anarchism I actually think only works in societies that are highly ethnically, culturally, or religiously homogenous. So
Mm,
culturally, Catalonia, ethnically, Rojava, Kurdish.
right. The Kurdish.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, and that's because that's a basis of social glue. Of course, you don't need a state when you have social glue.
This is
That's
actually a
when they
very good
say
point.
when they always say, "Oh, indigenous societies were stateless." Yeah, because they're the same common people. There's trust. You don't need a state preventing people from stealing each other's shit and enslaving each other.
I
There's
guess
social
the same
trust.
kind of goes for socialist syndicalism, would you say, as well?
So, because socialist syndicalism is based on
Is
workers,
anarchism.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's different because it's very like worker centric, and I think it made sense at a time.
Yeah.
But we're not in a time where workers actually have
Right.
nearly the level of power they do.
Right.
We're in a kind of gig economy world where
Right.
workers are very atomized. So if anything, right, like the kind of collective worker power, I would like that to happen. But
Yeah.
part of I think the appeal of the republicanism is that it can kind of like unify the working class and the petite bourgeoisie, who are much more becoming like each other. If you look at what a kind of like gig economy worker, it's basically a freelancer who technically owns something, maybe, but like really they're downwardly mobile. They have
Yeah.
very little freedom, or the very like precarious petite bourgeois who like, will often go out of business if they don't get a government loan, If the interest rate goes up a little bit, they'll get shattered.
Right.
It's
Well,
just
that's actually why.
they also have a common interest against rent, which I think rent,
Right.
if you can get people behind one form of capital first and foremost before any other capital, because that's the thing. In practice, no society was actually able to really get rid of all the capitalists right away and successfully. This is a fantasy, abolish capitalism. Primary and secondary contradictions. I really think like landlords, big landlords, landowners, people who make their wealth from rent extraction, finance capital. This is where you can unify people on, because there's just a lot of common class interest there, as opposed to the idea of I'm critical actually of broad wealth taxes, because wealth taxes in principle I support, but I actually think you would kind of probably curtail the economy in a huge way that might cause the leftists to lose a lot of short-term popularity
Mm-hmm.
and cause a dangerous situation, because you
Definitely.
hit all capital at once. I think you should do land, because land you can also do. There's no capital mobility threat there. You can
Right.
really you can set limits on land property ownership and dramatically improve the living conditions of people when it comes to housing and affordability, because that doesn't have the same repercussion as part of why I'm critical of social democracies, because it just doesn't, it's not fitted for a globalist capitalist environment of capital flight. If you tax wealth, they can just if it's liquid, and they can just liquefy it and bring it elsewhere.
This is related, this corporate communism thing. I mean, first of all, I think we should do our best to always destroy and deconstruct this label and point to its inaccuracies. But listen to this. I don't know if you've read Clyde Barrow's work on the lumpen proletariat in today's time. One of his arguments that's quite interesting is that, the kind of 60s Marxist theory that argued that it's only the lumpen proletariat that's the revolutionary class, it's no longer the working class.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, Barrow does not endorse that. I think that's a silly thing to say. Very few people hold that view today, but
Some leftists do.
some do. Some do.
That's why they support looting whenever there's they say they defend looting.
But here's the interesting kind of point about all of this, which is that he expands the category of the lumpen proletariat not to be like marginal thieves and petty thieves and criminals and black market people, engaged people that are outside of formal economy. He also includes like the huge swath of like retirees, the huge swath of precarious reserve army labor in between. And so he broadens the category of lumpen proletariat. But one of the things he shows is that the Democratic Party benefits from this class conflict, because most of the time the voting patterns, even though this class doesn't vote at the same level as like the middle class and so on, tend to be for policies that are on the side of the bureaucracy, not on the side of the workers. Because implicit in the bureaucracy is a kind of pandering to them, right?
Yeah, this is Musa Al-Gharbi's critique, and We Have Never Been Woke,
Right.
of why the whole will tax the rich is a kind of policy that, the whole 99%, we are the 99%, is a kind of PMC myth, because of
Oh
course
yeah.
the elite is way more than 1%. It's
So
probably
the
closer to
question,
20%.
right. So the question for me would be, so a working class socialist movement would have to, let's say, like reroute the ideological capture that professionals have put the lumpen proletariat in. And it kind of dovetails and tracks with this whole fetish of minority struggles in a class way, you see? So I would just recommend people read Clyde Barrow's work. He's been on my show before. And I think that that's the question that perhaps socialist republicanism would have to think about very carefully. Because even though we don't have, like, we're post welfare state, that's actually not totally true. That's actually not totally true.
Yeah, no, of course you want to expand it in some ways.
You want to expand it in some ways.
Well, I
And
don't like, yeah, just maybe not welfare, right? I view welfare and UBI as very actually, I'm very skeptical of those policies, but in terms of universal health care, that is a socialist idea. I mean, there's just not any
right.
capital interest there. Like Canada still has that tradition. They've been trying to cut it for ages and but it's still like, I mean, it is a socialist idea. Like the idea that everyone has an equal right to like
Sure.
health.
No, that needs to be affirmed, but what needs to be avoided and pointed out is the way that the bourgeois parties manipulate the class conflict between the working class and the lumpenproletariat in ways that serve their interest and which alienate and marginalize the working class interest and send the working class to the right.
Yeah,
And
or just not
it makes
voting.
sense.
Yeah, we're just not voting.
And I've often shared this anecdotally, like coming from the background that I come from. I have seen the resentments that are born on a local, intimate level between people that work wage labor and people that get welfare. And that actually stows a lot of irrationalism and resentment. And that's what the system is meant. That's what it's meant to do. That's why bourgeois politics always bottoms out into a civil war. And that's what Michéa says when he says socialism is for separatism. What that means is that we reject the civil war that bourgeois politics ensnares us in.
Mm. And that's
Yeah.
part of the left and right
Yeah.
divide.
And that's part of the why there's a fictionalism behind the left and the right divide.
Mhm.
In a way, we need to like redefine that double bind. And that's the
I
task
totally
of
agree.
socialism.
I totally agree.
You know?
With corporate communism, there's one thing I gotta say to elaborate, just so it doesn't get
Sure.
misconstrued. So, like, it's kind of obvious if I advocate socialism that I don't think, I see. Like for me, socialism shouldn't be government control of everything. I don't think that's what it is. I think it's the really distribution of power in the hands of the people who do the work. I mean, it's quite simply put. It's not like this government control of everything. I always find that laughable whenever people call it that or think that that's what socialism is, because class hierarchies before capitalism were established on the basis of state ownership. So the Catholic Church was common ownership of the land, and but it was, of course, in the name of everybody. But it was, a hierarchy. With the corporate communist fantasy, there's a kind of idea that's either explicitly stated or implicit, which is that what we should do now is just, there's no left socialist movement, but what we should do is fight the right and continue the neoliberalism, continue the centralization of monopolies. And what will happen is that somehow socialists will take over and we'll nationalize them, and then we'll have socialism.
Mm.
And I think that this is one very phantasmatic because it ignores all the contradictions. But it's in kind of even people I like, actually, like Lee Phillips. It's kind of in his fantasy a little bit. It's
Well, it
in
doesn't organize the working class. It doesn't
yeah,
do that.
well, yeah,
Doesn't do
and
that.
it's a PMC fantasy too,
It
because
is.
it's statist, top down kind of
Right.
control.
Right.
Because it's like, you think about it, like, this is why I'm very skeptical of statist projects, because it's easy to imagine that the vanguard party will be this working class party that is socialist and does the right things, but there's no guarantee of that. And even if you did get the Bolsheviks or something, there's no guarantee that that party wouldn't decide it's in their interests to actually become the ruling class. Mao realized this, except, instead of throwing a bunch of student bodies at the party, I think really you should just have an institutional mechanism of preventing that centralization from the beginning, which is
Yeah.
where republicanism
Right.
comes in. We can get into the technicalities of it. There's various ways you could structure a republic. Could be a separate discussion. But it's like this idea that if we just accelerate the current process of monopolization and also globalization, because, a lot of communists will say we believe in a classless, stateless, moneyless, borderless society. So if you believe in a stateless society, you believe in a borderless society. So you actually want capitalist globalism to still triumph, because what will happen is, like, this sets the condition for international socialism.
That's the Leninist point.
A little bit about the
It is.
monopolies. I don't know so much about the
Well, it,
global.
it rings it
Even,
rings very close to
but
the
even then,
antechamber.
I think that's wrong, and it's also
I
kind of
think it's wrong.
dystopian. It's also dystopian because you think about, like, what that does.
Right.
Because if there's no, like, internationalism from below, which isn't really like internationalist politics, it's just international trends.
Yeah.
That's like a dissolution of culture. Like, that's why people complain about globalism. It's just you have McDonald's is everywhere instead of the local chains. I mean, what do we want that? But just like government-owned McDonald's, like that sounds terrible.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't want that. I think the disintegration of culture, that's a horrible idea. Like and it's also just I think what this is like the corporate communist fantasy is the ultimate perverted fantasy of the fallen professional. So it's like, you know, think about the liberal professional. They often have this fantasy in the more mainstream liberal form. So they believe, like, you know, the EU, they believe in Brussels, they believe, well, we all trade together, get along. But when they don't get a position, they don't get to work for the EU, they don't get to work for Biden, or they don't get to work for whatever, they don't get the professorship, they're all whatever. They might be like, they would develop a resentment, and that kind of comes into the adoption of communist radicalism. But there's a powerlessness, so that's why it devolves into fantasy. So it's like
Yeah.
fantasy scenarios of where like a vanguard can just go and socially engineer the mass instead. And
That's
it's
an
like, I don't know.
interesting
I
point.
don't think if socialism is a movement, it can't just be a coping fantasy. Like,
No, that's an interesting point about resentment, because in my book on Nietzsche, you may remember I have a whole theory of resentment where I argue that in fact working class resentment is a little bit different than fallen professional resentment, in the sense that in order for that kind of resentment to have be so acute, to be so strong, it is born from a social promise that's imbued from your origins and your habitus. But that's not what working class resentments are born from, because working class people are not born with these expectations that are imposed upon them. So they're absent of that. So it's a completely different phenomenon, in fact. So it's a very interesting like class point on resentment. And I mean, obviously, the problem I have with the Nietzschean theory of ressentiment is that it sort of becomes the locus for thinking politics, and it's ultimately becomes kind of self-defeating and narrow. And it's very hard to be materialist when you think everything is driven by ressentiment and stuff like that. It's what I call the ressentiment complex. So in closing, Tony, this has been quite a journey. Thank you for all of your insights here. What have we what have you wanted to say, if anything, to pick up on? Any kind of threads perhaps to
mhm.
yeah, to reanimate in our
Yeah,
closing moments here?
sure. Well, you know, there's a set of comments I always get is in response to a lot of these sort of critiques that I give, and some of them were in the last comment section. Whereas one, you simultaneously get people who say, "Oh, these leftists you're talking about who harbor these beliefs, I don't see them. What are you talking about? They don't exist." And then you also get people in the comment section who exert those very same tendencies. So it's always funny to see. And I'll say, like, when it comes to these sort of fantasies we were just talking about, the PMC fallen professional fantasy, corporate communist fantasy, you once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's in the language they use. Okay. They'll say stuff like, "Oh, we just need to educate people. When we take power, sometimes literally, when we take power, we will just we'll re-educate them." I mean, they come out and say it. Or "Oh, we just need to do better propaganda." It's all this presumption that we already know. They don't know. It's the same PMC mentality, but it's rogue because it's like, unlike the mainstream liberals, it's not in power.
I would say it's not
So,
only PMC. I would also say it's a youthful identification of hope over despair,
well, a
right?
lot of
Like,
a lot of the fallen professionals are younger people, right? Because it's harder to get like tenure, it's harder to move up the ladder. So actually, I would say that's part of the material rise of these sort of tendencies. I actually, it's so this is why my prediction is, you know, the people say is wokeism dead or whatever. I think it will be in a lot of places, but it'll get worse before it gets better in the academy because of this next generation that's below the ladder of the older generation that's been clinging on to their tenure, right? There's this other like millennial generation that I'm terrified of how bad they're going to make the academy. But at a certain point, once it starts hurting business, if it starts hurting business, maybe, you know, then they'll go against it. But then they'll just get different forms of PMC ideology. Like there is right wing PMC ideology. You know, in many ways, a lot of the gender war stuff you see, there's a working class conservatism, and there's a kind of a PMC urban conservatism, which is a sort of reaction against people they had to adapt to like this social progressivism and they just don't like it. And they're like, I hate this. Now, yes, I can finally complain about it, which is like, sometimes they're right to complain, but it's very different, coming from a very different place than
Yeah.
a person who just wants to be left alone
Hmm.
and like have issues that matter to them.
Yeah.
Like that's like the culture warriors, right? Are usually PMC people. Like I would say like full-time culture warriors on the right and left are usually like people of a lot of privilege,
Well,
right?
that's actually why I feel like the thing I like the most about the Michéa Orwell argument of socialism as common decency is that, yes, it puts a big onus on the independent organization of the working class that entails a culture. But notice this, the outcome of that is a de-intensification of cultural conflict. That's kind of its presupposition that is so beautiful, which is that actually, no, it means that liberalism doesn't trust the common people to arbitrate cultural differences with themselves. Socialism does. And moreover, socialism would affirm that common people, the masses, the working class, etc., uh, will lean towards not the throwing everything into culture war stuff as the locus of all politics. No, I think actually the outcome would be a de-intensification of it. And that's, I think, what we need, because it does become a barrier to materialist proletarian politics when it's so centralized. And liberalism requires it to be like that, you know? It really requires it, and that's a super pernicious thing. Um,
And like Musa Garbi's We Have Never Been Woke, he does this great point where he like empirically demonstrates through like so much extensive polling data and charts about how when it comes to cultural attitudes, not economic attitudes,
right,
it's actually been that the left, or quote unquote like really liberals, but the liberal and left, like I said, they're complicit in each other. More so liberal left is with the liberals. Um, they've moved further left on cultural issues. It's not that people have been moving right. The right is a reaction to that. Like when you move super far left on culture and not on economics, that's just a recipe for like pissing off the working class and ceding them to right-wing populists. And the reason why right-wing populists are popular, because they're populists. Populism itself is appealing to the common sentiments. And look, I know some people are critical of populism. Like I know Varn is critical of populism. Our comrade Derek Varn. I would agree that like social democracy or populism that's so vague and only centered on messages and not ideas, I would be critical of, because in general you can't just think it's all about messaging. Like, oh, we just need a better messaging. It's also about the ideas, mostly about the ideas. The
right,
content, the form is a downstream of the content, in my view. It's not actually separate.
right.
Um, but what I would say to the people who are just kind of like, okay, skeptical of the populism entirely, it's like, I am yet to see an alternative. And this is the thing about where I would even be critical of Chris Catrone, who I have on the show a lot, and Platypus. To me, I'm critical of, well, actually in recent direction, I like where he's gone, because now he's actually for organizing and for like collaborating with all kind of socialist groups. So actually maybe this criticism won't apply, but it's that sometimes like there's this distrust of populism because of its inevitable perfect
Yeah,
character. Like there's going to be an imperfect character if you don't challenge the common sense of the masses, because with common sense there's also common dogmas,
right,
there's prejudices, right? But I'm yet to see an alternative that at all,
right. Well,
like at
that's
all that makes like anything,
yeah,
or even to like republicanism, right? There's critiques of republicanism. Like sure, it's had its limits. It's often been co-opted by liberals,
hmm,
but it's like, I think what's far more disastrous is an illiberal politics that doesn't have an alternative to liberalism, because what it'll choose is the oldest form of government, despotism,
right,
which is, state control of everything, or demagoguery, ceding power to a figure. I mean, that's kind of the danger of the far right, is like so far the far right has been mostly imbued into parliamentarism, which is good, so it doesn't get too extreme. But with the rise of Curtis Yarvin and Nick Fuentes, you are starting to see a return of like Schmittian ideas that are saying, well, democracy, it doesn't really represent the people. Actually,
Right.
one powerful state and party can represent the interests of the people better. It's
Right.
like a return of classic Caesarism,
Well,
Bonapartism.
that's actually why I would have one book to recommend to you from Ellen Maskin Wood, the great Marxist historian you may know of.
I've read quite. She went to the same university that I did.
Oh, cool.
She taught there, but she died right before I was in grad school.
She wrote a book on the history of Republican philosophy, political philosophies, called Liberty and Property.
Yeah, I actually have it right.
Yeah, you're aware of it. Yeah. So in this book, she does show that yeah, there it is. Yeah, it's really good. So I love the little highlighted notes. That's nice. So one of the things that she says, we're going to close here. Maybe we'll have to have you back on to talk about these things. And I think the populism point, obviously 2016 Bernie Sanders populism versus, say, Fetterman populism or even Graham Plattner populism are so different,
Oh yeah,
right? And yeah, I think as we articulated earlier, that kind of out of the box, almost spontaneous anti-establishment populism has
right.
all of the trappings
Oh yeah,
of a Marxist socialist project.
because it comes out of nowhere. Like people are skeptical of Graham Plattner because like no one knew who he was till very recently, and it's like he doesn't have much credibility. So it's like
Right.
I do think sometimes the left is a little too much with like it's how it talks about veterans, but in his case, I mean, he just comes out of nowhere and he has this weird ass backstory that's very sketchy. It's like I totally get why people are skeptical of him.
Sure. Well, anyways, okay. Much to be continued. Thank you all so much for listening to these 2 episodes with Tony of One Dime. Please support Emancipations, and also please support One Dime Radio, the podcast, and the main YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your time, Tony, and until next time, comrades.
Thank you.